What really happened to the Fellowship after the Lord of the Rings? Here is what the story never tells you. The ring was destroyed, the king was crowned, the hobbits went home. And if you only ever watched the films, or only ever read the final chapters, you would walk away believing that the Fellowship's story ended in triumph. A long-deserved triumph, earned in fire and grief and impossibility. The kind of ending that justifies everything that came before it. But Tolkien did not end the story there. He kept writing. Quietly, in the appendices, in letters, in footnotes and chronological tables that most readers never reach. And what he wrote there is not a triumphant coda. It is something far stranger and far more devastating. It is the accounting. The slow, decade-by-decade record of 9 lives pulling apart from each other across the long Fourth Age, each one carrying wounds that the victory did not heal, each one receding from the others one by one, until the last of them was finally, irrevocably, alone. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down. And the question it opens, once you see it fully, is one that Tolkien never quite answers directly. Was the Fellowship's dissolution, that slow dispersal of 9 radically different beings across decades of quiet private grief, the true price of the ring's destruction? The cost that Tolkien buried in the appendices because it was too still, too ordinary, too achingly human to fit inside the story itself? Do not answer that yet. We are going to earn the answer. Let us start with the moment the Fellowship ended, not at the Grey Havens, not at the Shire, at a riverbank, in the late afternoon light, with an arrow in Boromir's chest, and everything that had been whole now broken. Parth Galen, Amon Hen, the eastern shore of the Anduin, the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 2, Chapter 10. This is where it actually ends. Picture this. Aragorn kneels over Boromir. The man of Gondor is dying. He has 3 arrows in him, Tolkien tells us, and he is still speaking, still confessing, still reaching for the absolution he thinks he does not deserve. He tried to take the ring from Frodo. He failed his oath. He knows it. And Aragorn, who is a king without a throne and a ranger without a home, who has spent this entire journey watching his Fellowship fray under the weight of what they carry, takes Boromir's gauntleted hand and tells him, "You have won the victory." He weeps. Not metaphorically. Tolkien says he weeps. And that is the last moment the Fellowship is whole, even in grief. Because Frodo is already gone. He took the boat. He is on the water, moving east, alone with Sam, who would not let him go alone. And somewhere in the woods behind Aragorn, Merry and Pippin have been taken by Uruk-hai, and are being carried toward Isengard at a run, and Gimli and Legolas are standing there, in the aftermath of a battle they barely survived, looking at a man who is dying, and a Fellowship that is already scattered across 3 different fates. They were 9 when they left Rivendell. They were not 9 again, not ever. Here is what nobody stops to examine about that fact. The films, and even most casual readings of the text, treat the Fellowship's fracturing as a story beat, a necessary structural division that splits the narrative into parallel tracks. Frodo and Sam, the hobbits going to Mordor, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, chasing the captured Merry and Pippin, Boromir, dead, Gandalf, lost in Moria, and then returned in white. It feels like a temporary dispersal, because stories have reunions, because the coronation scene exists, and the Grey Havens scene exists, and we see them together again, older, changed but together. But here is what those reunion scenes actually are. They are brief, they are counted in days, and they are the last times most of these 9 beings ever occupy the same space. The coronation of Aragorn in the Third Age, year 3019. After that, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin return to the Shire. Gandalf accompanies them to the borders of the Shire, and then rides on to find Saruman. And by the appendices, it is confirmed that Gandalf then travels with the 3 elven ring-bearers, Elrond, Galadriel, and Celeborn, toward the Grey Havens. He does not go back to the Shire. He does not wait for the hobbits. By the time Frodo and his companions deal with the scarring and its aftermath, Gandalf is already past them, already moving toward the shore, already preparing to leave a world he spent 20 centuries serving. Aragorn stays in Gondor. He must. He is the king. He and Arwen build a life, and it is a good life, Tolkien tells us in Appendix A. A long and fruitful reign. But he never returns to the Shire. He never sits again in a hobbit hole with a pipe. He never walks the fields of the Gladden or the lanes of Bree. The Aragorn who becomes Elisar, and the Aragorn who sat at Frodo's bedside in Rivendell and knew the names of the Athelas plant in 5 languages, are the same man, but the world between those 2 moments had reshaped him so completely that the second one could not go back and be the first again. Legolas, Appendix B tells us, comes to Gondor after the war and dwells there for a time. He brings elves from Greenwood. He plants trees. He and Gimli travel together, and this is significant in ways we will return to at length, because Legolas and Gimli's friendship is one of the most cosmologically improbable relationships in the entire legendarium. But eventually the elves begin to dwindle from Middle-earth, and something has already happened to Legolas that Tolkien recorded in The Return of the King, Book 5, Chapter 9, that will not leave him alone. A seagull cried at Pelargir. That is all. One seagull, during the river battle before the siege of Minas Tirith. And Tolkien writes that Legolas heard it, and from that moment forward was marked by the sea longing, the yearning for Valinor that elves could not survive indefinitely without answering. The word Tolkien uses in the original is complicated. It is not quite a desire. It is more like a calling, written into the nature of his being, that, once triggered, could not be untriggered. Every year he remained in Middle-earth was a year spent resisting something that was pulling at the core of what he was. He resisted it for decades, because of Gimli. Pay attention to that, because it is the most specific and most unexamined sacrifice in the entire post-war story. Legolas, an immortal being of the First Age's children, a son of Thranduil, a prince of Greenwood the Great, spent years of his eternal life deferring his own spiritual healing, his own return to the land where his people were meant to dwell, because he would not leave while Gimli was still alive, because Gimli could not sail to the undying lands, because the friendship they had built across the War of the Ring was something that Legolas, apparently, valued more than he valued relief from what was slowly hollowing him out. We will come back to what this actually costs him, but first we need to follow the hobbits home, because that story is quieter and more brutal than anything else in the appendices. Frodo returns to the Shire in the Third Age, year 3019. He has been gone a long time, long enough that Lotho Sackville Baggins has taken over, long enough that the Shire itself has been industrialized and scarred, trees felled, buildings uglified, everything that made it the Shire dimmed and made grey. The scarring of the Shire, which Peter Jackson famously cut from the films, is in some ways the most honest scene Tolkien ever wrote about what it means to survive a war. You cannot go home. You can fight for home. You can save home. But the act of fighting changes you, and the home you save is never precisely the home you left, and the self that went away is not the self that comes back. Frodo scours the Shire. He and his companions push out Saruman. He stops the hobbits from killing Grima Wormtongue, even after everything, even after what Grima did to Rohan, even after what both of them did to the Shire. And Saruman, in his last moment of spite, tells Frodo something that is almost worse than a curse. He says, "You have grown, halfling. Yes, you have grown very much. And you will end up as a great fool." He says this because Frodo will not let him be killed, and Saruman cannot understand mercy that is not weakness. But there is something else in that line, something Tolkien lets hang in the air without quite naming. Frodo has grown. He has been changed, and the Shire that he has just saved does not entirely know what to do with what he has become. The appendices tell us that Frodo served as deputy mayor of the Shire for a brief time. He completed the Red Book, the account of Bilbo's and his own journey that would eventually become the foundation of what we are reading. He lived quietly. He did not campaign for office or make speeches or tell his tale to eager audiences. He was not broken, but he was not restored either. Tolkien's word, in Book 6, Chapter 9, is that Frodo was wounded, not mortally, but deeply, by what had happened to him, by the ring, by the knife on Weathertop, by the sting at Shelob's lair, by Gollum's bite on the slopes of Mount Doom, which is what finally severed the ring from the world, but which also severed something from Frodo that no Athelas, and no warm fire, and no hobbit cooking could grow back. And here is what Tolkien writes. In that final chapter, on the road to the Grey Havens, Frodo says to Sam, "I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me." 6 words that carry the entire weight of what the war cost him. Not for me. It is not bitterness. That is important. Frodo is not bitter. He is lucid. He has understood something true about his situation, and he is saying it simply, clearly, without drama. The Shire is saved for Sam, who will plant trees and raise children and live a long, full hobbit life inside the thing they fought to preserve. It is saved for Merry and Pippin, who will grow tall and famous and sit in honor at festivals. It is saved for Rosie Cotton and her family, and the Gamgees and the Tooks, and everyone who never had to carry what Frodo carried. It is not saved for Frodo. He lives there. He stays. He writes. He tries. But he is like a window looking out on a garden he cannot enter. And this is where Tolkien's letter 154 becomes indispensable. Writing to Naomi Mitchison, Tolkien is explicit about what the passage west actually means for Frodo. He says, it is not immortality. It is not even, precisely, a reward. It is a mercy granted to a wounded being whose wounds cannot be healed within the circles of the world. The Undying Lands are not paradise in any simple sense. Tolkien says that even in Valinor, Frodo will eventually die. He will die in the West, healed and at peace, but he will die. What the passage grants him is the time and the place to become whole enough to face that death without the wound still open. Think about that for a moment. Frodo sails west, not because he won, but because what he carried marked him in ways that the world he saved could not repair. He goes because Middle-earth, even healed, even with the shadow lifted, does not contain whatever it would take to make Frodo whole again. He sails in the Third Age, year 30021, with Gandalf and Bilbo and Galadriel and Elrond and Celeborn, and Sam stands on the dock at the Grey Havens and watches the ship go until it is gone. And then Sam turns around and rides home, and it is not the end of his story, it is barely the middle. Because here is the detail the films compress into a single, perfect, tearful scene. Sam comes home to Bag End, Tolkien writes, at the end of that same chapter, and he says, "Well, I'm back." And that is the last line of The Lord of the Rings proper, and it is a beautiful line. It is one of the most quietly devastating final lines in all of literature, because it contains everything it does not say. But the appendices keep going. Appendix B tells us that Sam Gamgee eventually departs the Grey Havens in the year of the Fourth Age, 482. He was made a ring-bearer, briefly, when Frodo gave him the one ring on the slopes of Emyn Muil during the first stage of their journey. And this brief bearing qualified him, Tolkien implies, for the same passage west that Frodo took. But he does not go when Frodo goes. He goes 61 years later. 61 years. After Rosie Cotton, who becomes Rosie Gamgee and bears 13 children by Sam, a number so specific, it has the quality of a deliberate gift. After a life so full of ordinary good things, grandchildren and harvests and local politics and the replanting of the party tree, that you might think Sam simply forgot about the West, simply put the memory of that dock and that ship and that disappearing figure behind him in the ordinary goodness of his days. But you would be wrong. Picture this, Sam Gamgee in his old age, long after Rosie has died, after his children have grown and scattered to their own lives, sitting outside Bag End on an autumn evening. He knows the Shire now, the way only very old people know a beloved place. He knows every tree he planted by hand, every lane he walked as a young man running errands for Mr. Bilbo and Mr. Frodo. He knows which windows light up in which season. He knows the sound the party field makes when the wind comes through just right. And he knows that somewhere, across a sea he has never crossed except once in terror, in a land his people do not have words for, his friend is waiting, or has been waiting, for 61 years, in whatever way an immortal land holds the dead and the healing. Tolkien does not write that Sam carried grief for those 61 years. He does not have to. The number is the grief. 61 years is the grief. That is almost a full Hobbit lifetime. That is Sam choosing to stay, and stay, and stay, until whatever it was that kept him in the Shire had been completed. And then, finally, very old and full of years and full of love, and full of something else that does not have a name, he goes to the Grey Havens, and he sails. And somewhere in the west, I believe, a door opens. But now let us go back and find Merry and Pippin, because their story is quieter still, and even stranger. The appendices tell us that after the war, both Merry Brandybuck and Pippin Took rose to prominence in the Shire and beyond. Merry became Master of Buckland. Pippin became Thane of the Shire. They were celebrated and beloved, and they grew tall for hobbits, which was partly the effect of the Ent draughts they drank in Fangorn, and this height made them objects of curiosity and respect. They visited Rohan and Gondor. They kept connections to the wider world that most hobbits never had and never wanted. They were, in the most precise sense, the Fellowship's ambassadors to ordinariness, the two members whose job it was to carry what they had seen back into the small and beloved world they came from. Pippin fought in the Battle of Bywater. He was a captain of the Shire hobbitry, and he acquitted himself well. But before that, he had looked into the Palantir of Orthanc, and Sauron had looked back at him, and whatever Pippin saw or felt in that moment, Tolkien leaves largely unexamined in the main text. What we know is that Gandalf had to ride through the night with Pippin before him on Shadowfax, hard and urgent, to get him to Minas Tirith before Sauron could trace the connection and find the Palantir. The vision Pippin had was not meant for him. He was not equipped for it. He was a young hobbit from a comfortable family who had stumbled into history, and he looked into a seeing stone and found a dark lord looking back. Merry, separately, was struck by the Black Breath after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, fighting under the name Dernhelm beside Éowyn. He stabbed the Witch King of Angmar. He helped end a creature that had been terror made physical for 3,000 years. And then the Black Breath settled into him, and Appendix A tells us, in the section on the House of Eorl, that the wound Merry took that day never entirely released him. Tolkien writes with the particular gentleness he reserves for hobbit suffering that Merry often felt a shadow of the old trouble in later years, when the weather was dark or the world felt heavy. He healed, he lived, he was happy, but he carried a shadow. He carried it into the Shire, and into his master's chair, and into his long, comfortable, beloved life, the way some wounds work, quietly, under the surface, usually invisible, surfacing only when the conditions were right for surfacing. And here is what Merry and Pippin did, at the end of their lives, that no casual reader of The Lord of the Rings ever hears about. They went to Gondor. They went to the House of the Kings in the Silent Street, where Aragorn, Elisar, king of the reunited kingdom, had been laid to rest in the year of the Fourth Age, 120. Appendix A tells us that after Aragorn's death, Merry and Pippin were brought to Gondor and laid beside him when their own time came. Not in the Shire, not in Buckland, not under a hobbit weight of green earth on the hill they knew since childhood, beside Aragorn. They chose, or someone who loved them chose for them at the end, to make that journey, to cross the vast distance between the Shire and the stone city at the feet of the White Mountains, to lay their old bones down in the house of the kings, rather than in the home they had fought to save. Now here is what that actually means. It means that whatever Merry and Pippin were to Aragorn, whatever Aragorn was to them, it was not simply comradeship in war. It was not simply the bond of shared danger that forges men and hobbits, briefly together and then releases them. It was something that lasted across decades of ordinary life, across the entire span of the Fourth Age up to that point. Something specific enough and real enough that at the end, the place that felt most right for them to rest was not the Shire, but Gondor. Not home, him. Think about the scenes in the films. The brief reunion at the gate of Minas Tirith. Aragorn lifting Merry and Pippin up in that moment of joy. It reads as warmth. It reads as the Fellowship's family instinct reasserting itself after loss. And it is that. But it is also, if you know what comes later in the appendices, a glimpse of something much larger and much quieter, a love between a king and two small people that outlasted the war by a century and then outlasted his death by whatever years remained in them, and found its end in stone and silence beside him. Tolkien does not editorialize about this. He gives it to us in a table of dates, and that restraint is its own form of devastation. We need to talk about Legolas and Gimli now, because this is where the story stops being merely tragic and becomes cosmologically strange. The friendship between Legolas Greenleaf, son of Thranduil, and Gimli, son of Gloin, is one of the most commented-on relationships in the Legendarium, and it is usually discussed in the terms that the films establish, a bickering odd-couple pairing that sweetens into genuine warmth. And that is true, but it does not go far enough. Here is what we are actually dealing with. An elf and a dwarf became friends. This sounds simple. It is not simple. These are two peoples whose enmity runs back to the First Age, to Doriath, to the killing of Thingol by the dwarves of Nogrod over the Noglamir, to centuries of mutual suspicion and disdain that hardened into something so cultural it was almost theological. Tolkien writes in the Silmarillion about the difference in the natures of elves and dwarves at their deepest level, their different origins. Elves the children of Ilúvatar's design, dwarves the children of Aule's longing, both beloved of the Creator, but differently, essentially differently. Their peoples had separate cosmological destinies, separate afterlives, separate relationships to the immortal West. Everything about what they were worked against what they became. And they became this, traveling companions, friends who traveled together through Fangorn and the glittering caves of Aglarond. An elf who delayed his own spiritual calling by decades so he would not have to leave while his friend was still alive. A dwarf who, when his friend finally built a ship and sailed, went with him, into the undying lands, the West, the country where no dwarf had ever gone. The undying lands, the realm of Valinor and the Blessed Realm, was not simply a place, it was a cosmological category. It was the land of the Valar and the Maiar and the Elves who had answered the summons of the powers at the beginning of time. It was not built for men. It was certainly not built for dwarves. The established order of Tolkien's cosmology as laid out in the Valaquenta and the Ainulindale is unambiguous on this point. The fate of men is beyond the circles of the world, out past Valinor, into the gift of Ilúvatar, which is death, and what comes after. The fate of dwarves, as Tolkien describes it in various places, is similarly unaddressed by Valinor's design. Aule made them, but he made them to die and be gathered to his halls, not to sail west. Gimli sailed west. Tolkien himself, in a note preserved in Unfinished Tales, Part 2, Chapter 4, on the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, expresses something that functions as genuine theological uncertainty about this. He does not fully explain it. He suggests it may have been possible because of Gimli's love for Galadriel, a reverence so profound and so pure that it had given him access to something in the elvish spiritual world that dwarves did not ordinarily touch. Or perhaps it was because of his friendship with Legolas, and Legolas's own grace carried him across a threshold he could not have crossed alone. But Tolkien does not resolve it. He leaves it as a possibility stated with the uncertainty intact. Maybe the Valar permitted it. Maybe they did not forbid it. Maybe the love between an elf and a dwarf was strange enough and real enough that it opened a door the cosmological order had never thought to make a rule about, because the cosmological order had never imagined it would need to. Picture this: Legolas at the Grey Havens, a ship of his own making riding the grey water. He built it himself, Appendix B tells us. He and his elves from Greenwood, a ship small enough for two, and beside him on that dock, Gimli son of Gloin, who is old now in the way dwarves go old, which is not the way hobbits go old, or men go old, but still old, still carrying the weight of a dwarf's long centuries. He does not know, perhaps cannot know, whether what he is about to do is permitted. He does not know whether the Valar will let him land, whether the shores of Valinor will receive a dwarf who came not because he was called, but because his friend was going, and he refused to be left. And Legolas helps him aboard, and the ship moves west. That image, that single image, contains within it the entire argument about what the Fellowship's bonds actually were. Not allegiance, not shared mission, not the temporary adhesion of people who needed each other to survive. Something that had no name in the cosmological order, because it had not existed before, because it had taken a war and a ring and 9 beings thrown together in impossible circumstances to create the conditions for it to exist at all. Now let us ask the question this raises, and not answer it immediately, because the answer is not simple. If Gimli's passage west was cosmologically unprecedented, if it required either Valinor's active permission or its deliberate non-intervention, if it was possible only because of what Gimli was in relation to Legolas and in relation to Galadriel, then what does that say about what the War of the Ring actually accomplished? The war destroyed the ring. It restored the king. It ended the immediate threat. But it also created, in the specific friendships and bonds it forged, something new in the world's order, something that had not been there before. A dwarf and an elf who loved each other enough to cross the threshold of death's geography together. Tolkien built a world in which every race has its cosmological lane, its assigned place in the great music, its designated fate beyond the world. And then he built a friendship that broke out of every lane. Was that accident, or was it the point? We need to come back to Boromir. I said we would, and here is why. Boromir died at Parth Galen. He died with 3 arrows in him, defending Merry and Pippin from the Uruk-hai, which is to say, he died trying to undo what he had done to Frodo. He died, in the most immediate and practical sense, in an act of redemption. And Aragorn, kneeling over him, said, "You have won the victory." It is perhaps the most generous line Aragorn ever speaks. He is telling a dying man that his last act has retroactively defined his character, that the thing he will be remembered for is not the moment on Amon Hen when he tried to take the ring, but the moment on the shore when he bled to save 2 small people who could not save themselves. The horn of Gondor is split in 2, Tolkien tells us, when Boromir dies. The horn that had sounded at his oathing, the great horn his father gave him, the horn whose note rolled across mountain and plain and marshland when he blew it at Amon Hen, while Uruk-hai arrows found him. It split, and Denethor in Minas Tirith heard it and knew. Before the ravens came, before any rider brought word, he knew. The split horn is one of those Tolkien images that carries more weight than it seems. The oath was broken when the oath-taker fell. The instrument of the binding cracked. But here is what I want to sit with for a moment. Boromir is the only member of the Fellowship whose post-war fate is not complicated. There is no appendix entry about his long years and quiet grief. There is no detail about what he carried into the peace. There is no table of dates recording the slow dissolution of his bonds with the others. There is only the boat of rushes and the silver horn and the cloak of grey and the falls of Rauros and Aragorn's tears. His story ended clean, and I do not know whether that is mercy or loss. Because here is the thing nobody says about Boromir directly. Every other member of the Fellowship had to survive the victory. Every other member had to come home carrying what they had seen and try to put an ordinary life on top of it, and discover what ordinary life felt like when worn over a wound that size. Frodo could not do it. Sam did it for 61 years and then sailed. Merry and Pippin did it for most of a century, and chose in the end to lay their bones in Gondor. Aragorn did it through a long reign and a good life, and a death that Tolkien calls the completion of his natural span. And yet still, Tolkien writes in Appendix A, at the last, he said to Arwen, I am the last of the Númenóreans, and the latest king of the elder days, and to me has been given not only a span of years, but also the grace to go at my will and give back the gift. And then he lay down and he died. That is not a simple death. That is a man who has been holding himself upright for 210 years, and who has finally been given permission to stop holding. Legolas sailed, Gimli sailed, Gandalf sailed, Sam sailed. Merry and Pippin rested beside Aragorn in the House of the Kings. And Frodo, long before all of them, had already gone. And what none of them could do was go back to the moment at Rivendell when Elrond looked at them all gathered around the fire and said, The company of the ring shall be 9, and the 9 walkers shall be set against the 9 riders that are evil. That moment before the valley, that moment before Caradhras and Khazad-dûm and Lothlorien and Amon Hen, that moment when they were all still whole and still together, and the worst that had happened to them was a long cold walk, and Frodo's shoulder still aching from Weathertop. That moment is gone. Every one of the 9 knew it was gone, and every one of them carried the knowledge of its goneness differently, across the different shapes of their different lives, like a stone of a specific weight and a specific texture that each of them learned to carry and eventually could not put down. This is the thing the appendices are actually about, not the chronology, not the facts of who died when and who sailed where. The appendices are about the weight of the afterwards, the specific gravity of lives lived in the long peace after catastrophic events. Now here is where it gets strange. Tolkien made a deliberate structural choice to put these fates in the appendices rather than in the story itself. He could have written the fates of the Fellowship into the main text. He could have given us a final chapter that followed each of them into their afterwards. He did not. He compressed it all into tables and notes and chronological entries and historical summaries, the equivalent of a footnote in the cosmic ledger. And this is not oversight. Tolkien was not a careless writer. He was one of the most architecturally conscious writers of the 20th century. He knew what he was doing. He was hiding the cost in the fine print. Because the story, the actual story, the one we experience as readers, is about the mission. Destroy the ring, save the world, win the war. And stories about missions need endings, and the ending Tolkien gave us is real, and it is earned. The ring goes into the fire, the world is saved, the good people go home. That is the story. But life after the mission is not part of the mission. Life after the mission is what happens to you when the mission is over. When the thing that organized your every waking hour and gave your suffering a purpose and bound you to 8 other people in a fellowship of desperate intent simply stops, and you are standing in the ruins of the Shire, or on the stone of Minas Tirith, or on the dock of the Grey Havens, and the organization is gone, and you are just yourself again. Except you are not just yourself. You are the self that went through that. You carry Weathertop and Moria and Lothlorien and the Pelennor and Cirith Ungol and the slopes of Mount Doom and the long grey light of Amon Hen, and you carry all of it into the ordinary morning of your ordinary afterwards life, and you discover what you were made of, which is both more and less than you thought. Picture this: Frodo Baggins, in the quiet years in the Shire before he sails, sitting with his account of the quest, his red book, trying to write the end of it. He has written Bilbo's part. He has written his own early chapters. He has written everything up to the moment in Mordor where his memory becomes too close and too hot to render in neat prose. And he is trying to find the ending, not the narrative ending, the meaning of the ending, the thing that all of it was for. He is trying to understand what he was part of, this small person who carried the most dangerous object in the world across the worst landscape in the world to the one place it could be destroyed, who by the end could not even lift it himself, who needed Gollum's madness and Ilúvatar's mercy to get it off his finger. He is trying to write that down, and the Shire is quiet around him. The birds are singing. Somewhere a cart is going down a lane, and none of it helps. The good morning is not the answer to the question, but it is all there is. And this, right here, is where the central question of this whole exploration lands, with its full weight for the first time. Was the Fellowship's dissolution the true price of the ring's destruction? We are not asking this abstractly anymore. We have seen Frodo's specific wound. We have seen Sam's 61 years. We have seen Merry's shadow and Pippin's Palantir terror, and Aragorn's long-held upright life, and Legolas's decades of sea-longing deferred for the sake of a dwarf's mortality, and Gimli's cosmologically anomalous journey, west and Gandalf's quiet return to the undying lands, and Boromir's clean ending and its haunting contrast with everyone else's complicated one. We have seen all of it, and the question now is, was this the deal? Was this what the destruction of the ring actually cost? Because Tolkien makes you pay in the appendices what he spares you in the story. He gives you the victory in the text and the reckoning in the endnotes. And if you only ever read the story, you take the victory home and feel the warmth of it. And if you read the appendices too, you discover that the warmth is real and the cost is also real. And both of those things are true simultaneously, and this is the most adult thing Tolkien ever wrote, this refusal to let the triumph be simple. Tolkien was a veteran. He fought at the Somme. He watched most of his closest friends die in that particular piece of organized horror. He came home, and he survived, and he built a life, and he wrote a mythology, and inside that mythology he built, again and again, the specific topology of life after catastrophic survival, the specific grief of the person who comes home when others did not, the specific strangeness of the world that looks the same and is not the same and can never be the same because of what you now know about what it can contain. He knew what he was writing when he wrote Frodo's specific estrangement from the Shire. He knew it the way only someone who has felt it knows it. Not from the outside, from the inside, and he built the appendices as the place where that knowledge lives in the text, quietly, in tables, in the formal register of historical chronicle rather than narrative prose, because the people who have survived the unsurvivable know that their survival does not become a story with a shape and a meaning and a narrative arc. It becomes a series of ordinary days, some good, some less good, some marked by a shadow that surfaces without warning, and they live through those days, and they carry what they carry, and they love who they love, and eventually, if they are very fortunate, they find the place where they can be healed. Frodo found it west of the world. Sam found it 61 years later, in the same direction. Merry and Pippin found it in the stone silence of the House of Kings beside their king. Legolas and Gimli found it together on a ship built by elvish hands. And Boromir, who did not survive to carry anything, found it on the water at Parth Galen, and the horn of Gondor cracked, and Aragorn wept, and the falls of Rauros took him south toward the sea. Let me say something about Gandalf here, because Gandalf's departure is the one that tends to get collapsed into the frame of the films. The wise wizard returns to whence he came, his mission complete, the world safe, off he goes. And that reading is not wrong, but it is not complete. Tolkien describes the Astari, the wizards, in Unfinished Tales Part 4, as Maiar of Valinor who were sent to Middle-earth clothed in flesh for a specific purpose, to encourage and counsel and inspire the free peoples in their resistance to Sauron, but not to dominate, not to use their full power to override the free will of those they guided. They were not sent to win the war. They were sent to help the world's peoples find the strength to win it themselves. Gandalf fulfilled this. He did it more fully and more completely than any of the other Istari. Saruman fell to the ring's logic and became a smaller version of what he was meant to fight. Radagast was distracted by the natural world and did not fail. Exactly, but did not do what was needed, either. Palando and LOTR went east, and Tolkien says, in letter 211, he always feared they had gone astray and become lords of some eastern cult, perhaps well-intentioned, but wrong in method. Only Gandalf did what a Maya clothed in flesh was sent to do. And then he went back. Picture this, Gandalf at the Grey Havens, in the autumn twilight of the Third Age's final year. He is still wearing the grey cloak, or something that looks like it, and the white that replaced it, worn like a habit now, a garment that became character during the fight against the Balrog in the deeps of Moria. He is standing with Frodo, with Bilbo, who is very old and very small and very happy to be going, with Galadriel, with Elrond, with Celeborn perhaps, though Tolkien places Celeborn's departure as a later date. He is not sad, in any ordinary sense. He is complete. The thing he was sent for is done. The world he worked across 20 centuries to preserve is preserved. The ring is gone. Sauron is gone. But he has been in this body, clothed in this flesh, breathing this air, for so long that I think he carries it with him. The specific weight of material existence, the memory of cold and hunger, and the joy of a good pipe. The specific quality of sunlight on the Shire fields that you cannot fully experience if you are not in flesh. He has been in this world, and he has loved it, with the specific love of a being who was not born of it, but chose to dwell in it, and chose again, every day to serve it. He goes back west carrying that love, not as wound, but as gift. Not every member of the Fellowship carries grief west. Some of them carry gratitude. But gratitude and grief, in Tolkien's world, are not opposites. They are the same coin, turned over. We have come far enough now to return to the central question with everything we have built. Was the dissolution of the Fellowship the true price of the ring's destruction? The cost, hidden in the appendices, too quiet and too real to fit inside the story itself. Let me say now what I think Tolkien actually believed, drawn from the text and from the letters, and from everything we know about the man who built this world in the aftermath of one war and revised it across the span of another. The Fellowship was not meant to last. Tolkien built it as a temporary structure from its inception. 9 beings thrown together by necessity and history, and Elrond's wisdom, drawn from every free people of Middle-earth, to mirror the 9 Nazgûl, to set Walker against Rider, living will against enslaved will. It was not a family. It was not a permanent covenant. It was a company assembled for a mission, and the mission was the bond, and when the mission was completed, the bond's immediate purpose was fulfilled. But what happened inside the mission, what the 9 of them became to each other across the miles of Caradhras, and the depths of Moria, and the golden light of Lothlorien, and the grey road to Gondor, that was not in the mission's brief. That was extra. That was what happens when beings of free will are thrown together in extremity and make, out of their fear and their courage and their specific differences, something that was not asked for and is not reducible to the task that organized it. The Fellowship dissolved. But what the Fellowship made, in the making of itself, did not dissolve. It persisted. It moved with each of its members into their separate afterlives. It was there in Sam's 61 years of patient waiting. It was there in Merry and Pippin's choice of stone over soil. It was there in Legolas's decades of deferred sea longing. It was there in Gimli's impossible journey west. Tolkien built a world governed by the Ainulindale, the great music sung before creation, in which everything that happens is in some sense woven into the music. Every grief, every joy, every war, and every peace. And the Ainulindale includes the discords. It includes Melkor's theme, which is not outside the music but woven into it, made part of the whole, incorporated into the greater pattern even as it resists the pattern. The griefs of the Fellowship, the slow dispersal, the sea longing, the black breath, the wound that Middle-earth could not heal, these are not outside the music. They are the music. They are what the music was building toward, when it built people capable of loving each other across every difference of kind and fate. Here is the thing this means. The dissolution of the fellowship is not a failure. It is not a tragedy in the sense of something that should not have happened. It is, in the deepest logic of Tolkien's cosmology, the completion of something. Not the completion the mission aimed for, the other completion. The one that happens to beings who have loved each other and lost each other and kept loving each other across the distance and the years until the last of them finally went west. The price was real. Every wound was real. Frodo's estrangement was real. Sam's 61 years were real. Merry's shadow was real. Legolas's sea longing was real. The slow dissolution of the fellowship was real. And it cost every one of them something they did not get back in the same form they spent it. But cost is not the same as waste, and dissolution is not the same as loss. They were 9. They are scattered across the chronology of the Fourth Age. And yet, in the appendices, in the tables and the footnotes and the brief chronicle entries, they keep appearing together in ways that prove the fellowship did not die with its mission. It changed form. It spread out across lifetimes and cosmological categories. It put a dwarf on a ship to Valinor, and 2 hobbits in a house of kings, and the world's greatest ring-bearer on a dock at the Grey Havens, saying the most precise and the most heartbreaking true thing anyone says in the whole of the legendarium: I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. And it put Sam on that dock, watching the ship go. And it kept Sam in the Shire for 61 years, with the knowledge that his friend was already where Sam could not yet go. And it finally put Sam on a ship of his own, at the age of very old, carrying a ring-bearer's grace and 61 years of an ordinary life, lived fully and well, and with the ache of a specific absence running through all of it. And somewhere in Valinor, I believe, a door opened. Now, the deepest version of the question. Was the fellowship's dissolution the true price of the ring's destruction? I do not think Tolkien would say yes. I do not think he would say no. I think he would say that this is not quite the right question, because price implies transaction, implies something paid in exchange for something received, and the logic of Tolkien's world is not transactional, it is participatory. The fellowship did not pay the price of dissolution in exchange for the ring's destruction. The fellowship participated in something so large and so real that it permanently altered every one of its members, and the alteration was both the cost and the gift simultaneously, and you cannot separate them, and perhaps that is the point. The Shire was saved, but not for Frodo. The sea longing took Legolas, but not before he and Gimli had traveled together for decades. The black breath marked Merry, but he still lived a long life and died in the honor he had earned. Sam grieved for 61 years, but he also had 13 children, and a replanted party tree, and Rosie, and mornings in the garden, when the world was exactly itself. Boromir died, but he died whole. Every one of these things is true. All of them, together, are what the War of the Ring actually cost, and actually gave. And here, finally, at the full depth of it, is the question I want to leave you with. Not the same question as the beginning, though it has the same root. What if the dispersal of the fellowship, the slow decades-long dissolving of 9 lives into their separate fates, was not the aftermath of the story, but the story's truest continuation? What if the appendices, with all their dates and distances and brief notes on mortality and departure, are not the footnotes to the real story, but the part Tolkien was working toward all along, the part that required everything else as its foundation? 9 ordinary and extraordinary beings who loved each other across every difference of kind and nature, and then went on to live and grieve and heal and wait and sail, each in their own way, each carrying the others inside them like a weight they had learned to love. The ring is gone. Sauron is gone. The Third Age has ended, and somewhere in the West, on a shore that the appendices do not describe, because Tolkien believed, in his bones, that some things should remain undescribed, somewhere beyond the circles of the world, The wounds are healing. They are healing slowly, in the way that real wounds heal. Not erased, transformed. If any of that settled somewhere in you, or if you carry a different reading of what the appendices are actually saying, I want to hear it. Because this is the kind of lore that does not resolve, that goes on opening the longer you carry it. The fates of the Fellowship are not a conclusion. They are an ongoing question about what it costs to survive the things that were worth surviving. Leave your own accounting below. Whatever you think Tolkien was hiding in the fine print. Whatever member of the Nine you keep coming back to. Whatever wound you think the victory did not heal and was not meant to heal. And if you want to keep going deeper into the parts of this world that the story does not quite reach, stay here. There is always another door.